internationally on 19th century Mexican landscape painting, ex votos, and visual representations of the New Mexico Pueblo peoples in Novo-Hispanic Franciscan martyr paintings. He recently curated a wonderful exhibition entitled Contemporary Ex Votos, Devotion Beyond Medium, and wrote an accompanying catalog published by the New Mexico State University Art Museum this spring. He's written an essay titled Beyond European Palettes, the Overlooked Contributions of Indigenized Artists in the Historiography of Painting in Mexico, that will appear as part of the Routledge Companion to Art and Empire. And his book, Visualizing Franciscan Anxiety and the Distortion of Native Resistance, The Domesticating Mission, is also under contract with Routledge. And his talk today, I believe, is entitled The Undomesticated Desert.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Can you all hear me? Should I be extra loud because construction? Okay, let's do it. No sé. Can you hear me now? Okay, awesome. There it is. Okay. In the mid-18th century in New Spain, hagiographic portraits were created to entice other novices to follow in the footsteps of leaders of the Franciscan Brotherhood, martyr, peregrino, or pilgrim, and what I call congregation portraits arose partly consequently to the order's push to kickstart a new golden age of missionizing in the eve of renewed attacks from numerous groups of indigenized tribes throughout the northern provinces of the Viceroyalty. The works are clear indicators of the Franciscans' loyalty towards the crown, while demonstrating a mendicant zeal necessary in the establishment and maintenance of missions throughout remote regions of that were also constantly under the threat of other European powers. When the Franciscans arrived in Mexico, they sought to build the kingdom of God on earth through missions that serve as centers of education and hubs for new Christian life, contributing to an epistemicide, that is the destruction and transformation of knowledge into unrecognizable forms. While Mesoamerican cultural practices persist, their potential to exist independently of European influence was lost. Epistemicide does not completely erase pre-Columbian spiritual knowledge, but rather transformed into forms that were both unrecognizable and yet familiar. These changes affected nearly every aspect of native life, altering views on sacrifice, overall spirituality, and the natural environment. Land shifted from an extension of one's existence to property, a commodity that distorted the self-identification of many communities. Space was redefined into colonial categories, with Franciscans actively facilitating this imperial transformation through their domestic, pastoral, and ascetic efforts. The so-called golden age of the 16th century mission era has traditionally been studied through the lens of spiritual conversion. The quote-unquote peaceful interventions, such as pastoral congregaciones y reducciones, or congregations and reductions, exemplify a form of slow violence that is hard to visualize. Environmental scholar Rob Nixon defines slow violence as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction, dispersed across time and space. This concealed slow violence, masked by the Franciscans' seemingly benevolent practices, is often contrasted with more immediate and visible colonial violence, which resulted in measurable deaths. Despite this, the Franciscan domesticating project is still considered a noble enterprise to this day. To uplift the order's enterprise, the glorification of its members was always emphasized. The domestication of souls went hand in hand with the domestication of the land. And during the first phase of the so-called Golden Era, images of preachers in the undomesticated wilderness, that is the desert, began to circulate in chronicles. These images demonstrated the friars' control over everything within their reach, from the humblest creatures to the most untamed savages. Consider Diego de Valadez predicando a los chichimecas, published in his theological manifesto, Retórica Cristiana, in 1579. Borrowing from images of St. Francis preaching to the birds, Valadez's works pointedly underscores the intended docility of the quote-unquote barbarians and how their resistance hindered a harmonious congregation. This control over the savages was meant to be achieved peacefully, thereby portraying the Franciscans as innocent in the bloody campaigns against the nomadic groups of La Gran Chichimeca. Following Nuño de Guzman's initial violent campaigns in El Bajío and the uprisings in Zacatecas during the mid-16th century silver rush, the Spanish crown considered total war against smaller nomadic tribes. This led to raids, the establishment of presidios, or fortified military settlements, and the securing of routes, resulting in decades of conflict. In Predicando a los Chichimecas, we see one of the earliest depictions of the anxiety that prevailed Franciscan visual representations of missionary outposts beyond central Mexico. The image shows a serene pastoral scene of a shepherd with his sheep, erasing the reality of the fierce conflicts and instead using the metaphor of pastoral care. In response to the Third Mexican Provincial Council of 1585, pressures from Dominican orders to avoid total war against the Chichimeca increased, which helps explain Valadez's peaceful pictorial interventions. According to historian and Catholic priest Stafford Pohl, the Franciscan report to the council can be summarized in 3 points. That is, continuous pacification of the Chichimeca through preaching and catechizing, prohibiting raids into native territories, and calling for an investigation into grievances against the Spanish, specifically the encomienda abuses. Pohl describes the solution as nothing more than Las Casas' plan of peaceful colonization, advocating for a softer intervention. Historian Mendez Alonso notes that the Chichimec conflict set legal precedents influencing later northern tribes, leading to the establishment of defensive forts and regimes of slavery benefiting soldiers, friars, and merchants. The imperial service of the Franciscans throughout the Bajío aided in appeasing the Chichimeca problem. That is, the impact the resistance had over the silver supply needed for global demand, the hindrance they presented to northern expansion, and the fear of disbandment or lack of control. In other words, what the Chichimeca conflict shows us is the understated and long-term impact of Franciscan slow violence. Such peaceful yet intense interventions were later felt in northern New Spain, including in the territories of New Mexico, Texas, and California. We'll give it a second. The tense situation in the Chichimeca is absent from the pictorial record, with the exception of some maps. The extant graphic material instead focuses on pastoral images highlighting the benefits of a healthy congregation. As conflict and resistant movements, especially from New Mexico peoples, grew, the Seraphic Order revisited mission philosophies established a century earlier. These revised tenets were disseminated through chronicles and through paintings in Franciscan education centers such as Propaganda Fide colleges, which coincidentally opened the first campus in Querétaro only 3 years after the Pueblo Revolution of 1680. And this was, of course, to promote missionary expansion. As noted by historian John Tutino, the decline in mining and following the Louisiana traders' outposts deep into Texas, the missionary efforts migrated even further north. Franciscans turned to the old pro-Indian vision, according to which dedicated friars bringing trade, tools, new ways of cultivation, and Christian truth could win natives for Christianity and the Spanish regime, with little force and less cost, end of quote. The constant threat of the French in Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico culminated with the edification of presidios and missions aimed as protection garrisons, reiterating the principal role of the Seraphic Brotherhood in the Americas. In 1737, this has a life of its own. In 1737, chronicler and missionary Fray Isidro Félix de Espinosa wrote the first Creole hagiographic work in Novo Hispanic history to honor Fray Margil de Jesús, el peregrino septentrional Atlante. Margil is often considered the patron saint of Texas, despite never having been canonized. Known as a missionary with winged feet, los pies alados, he's remembered as an uniting pilgrim who traveled from Costa Rica to Texas. He was a founding member of the Propaganda Fide colleges in Querétaro, Zacatecas, and Guatemala, and his missionary legacy has seldomly been problematized. Take the next passage by Espinosa as an example of his colonial imperatives. We see that continuous work tames steel, softens bronze, reduces gold to fine leaves, and crafts the constancy of diamonds. Texas are not the countries that hide these materials among hard rocks, because the land is more populated with trees and spring than with stones. Nor do the natives of his inhabitants emulate the ferocity of the Ircanian tigers. But even in the hardness of hearts were great, the continuous effort of this apostolic worker would have softened their stubbornness and smoothed all of the difficulties that were an obstacle to their fervent desires. Here, the new settler preoccupations, as noted above, shifted from a need to domesticate uncharted territories to the protection of its frontiers. It is no coincidence that within the next paragraph, the author explains how Margil offered confession and mass to the French, which were stationed only 5 leagues away from that mission, taming yet another threat to empire. Espinosa's pictorial portrayal of Margil echoes the congregation portraits introduced in Valadez in the Retórica nearly 2 centuries earlier. Placing these images side by side supports historian Esteban López Argueda's argument that Valadez preacher model remains relevant in Espinosa's work. Quote, Margil embodies the characteristics of the good man described in the Retórica Cristiana. He represented both the ideal counter-Reformation priest and the memory of Novo Hispanic missionaries of the Golden Age, end of quote. In both images, the friars control their respective groups of unruly nomads, highlighting the power of preaching. Like Valadez, Margil relies solely on words and a crucifix for defense. The depiction of nomads, bows, arrows, and minimal clothing in both images underscores how the ongoing anxiety about subduing northern tribes migrated from the Chichimeca to the fringes of New Spain. Historians often link congregation portraits to hagiographic works. while art historians focus on the image of the devout Indian and its connection to Christ's sermon of the Beatitudes. However, these images also reveal the underlying violence of pastoral missionary efforts, obscuring the ongoing impact of reducción y congregación policies on Native groups since the 16th century. As explained by historian Daniel Nemster, the Spanish system of congregación, implemented during the various waves of colonization throughout the Americas, also known as reducción, sought to resettle and disperse indigenous communities into centralized towns under the watchful gaze of the colonial authorities. The indio, Nemser explains, was a racial category that was invented in order to shift an identification of peoples from their native place of origin to a racial and labor-based identification. The ritualization of indigenous population into rural cities paradoxically contributed to the emergence of an increasingly deteriorized Indian as a meaningful category of identity detached from the Altepetl that had previously served as its anchor and instead constituting a racialized, relatively mobile, laboring population. This enterprise, as Nemser asserts, is a pastoral technology, a way for the pastor to gather a loose flock for more effective exploitation. The ubiquitous presence of congregation portraits in church altars, chronicles, and monastic centers contrasts sharply with the rarity of images depicting what art historian Pedro Ángeles Jiménez calls the fraile peregrino. The case of Margil, as represented in chronicles and portraits, is particularly significant given the seraphic order context at the time. López Arguedas argue, quote, "This revival by the missionaries of Propaganda Fide occurs as the Franciscan missions lose prominence to the Jesuits in northern Mexico," end of quote. Margil's promotion as an itinerant missionary, willing to brave the empire's periphery, mirrors Valadez's example from 2 centuries earlier and reinforces key imperial and theological principles of the Franciscans in New Spain. Historian Randolph Daniel argues that the core tenet of the Franciscan mission is, quote, "an evangelical way of life through an utter imitation of Christ, both inwardly and outwardly, through a universal apostolic ministry," end of quote. In previous publications, I have conceptualized this dual practice as a twofold liminal missionary tradition. Franciscan liminality as one side, living outside mainstream culture, and colonial liminality, operating on the empire's fringes. This duality is exemplified by Margil's promotion, not merely as a congregational leader, but as a fraile peregrino, whose spiritual itinerancy, spiritual movement, also supports imperial expansion by securing the northernmost missions. His walking, as noted by Espinosa, represented la caridad de Cristo en el desierto. These portraits depict him as a weary yet persistent traveler, navigating through wild and inhospitable territories. And artistically, the desert is portrayed as a place of spiritual retreat and introspection, using familiar graphic conventions such as lavish landscapes rendered in blues, reflecting Flemish artistic traditions popular throughout the Americas. Margil never directly faces the viewer. His introspection appears focused on his cautious steps, Espinosa notes. The venerable Margil traveled this new world with such diligence and agility that there was no undergrowth to slow him down, no distance to stop him, no mighty rivers to astonish him, no imminent danger to frighten him. Let the Texas and Nayares, and finally the most remote parts of this whole new world say it. Better than Mercury, I said, we call Venerable Margil's feet light feathers, because Mercury walked fast on his wings, but the Reverend and Venerable Margil left his wings behind when he walked fast. In El Peregrino Septentrional, his footsteps are the site of admiration, and their absence is proof of his innocence. Father Antonio seems to have come on the shoulders of angels because he has not gotten wet and it has rained a lot on the way. There you go. And it has rained a lot on the way, and we have carefully looked at the ground, and we have not seen a stamp of his feet. The literal erasure of his footprints obscure his role in imperial complacency. I argue that beyond Margil's seemingly innocent and introspective wandering, the portraits, and certainly his hagiography, conceals his colonial liminality. The practice of walking depicted beyond mere hermeneutical retreat. Jesuit philosopher Michel de Certeau asserts. There is no spatiality that is not organized by the determination of frontiers. The opacity of the body in movement, gesticulating, walking, taking its pleasure, is what indefinitely organizes a here in relation to an abroad, a familiarity in relation to a foreignness. In the context of Margil's life, both in pictures and words, his itinerancy was also a way to measure distances between colleges and missions, a physical mapping that allowed for the calculation of travel time and transportation costs. Spoiler alert. Espinosa's accounts are filled with figures of leagues, travel. Margil's journeys reinforce the structure of empire, establishing patterns of land domestication, defensive garrisons, and future urban planning. Just as the crown required Franciscan pastoral practices to aid in the 16th century domestication and exploitation of the Chichimeca region, also in its newly discovered mines. In short, Margil's expeditions marked the beginning of a century with imperial interventions were secured by the dual liminality of mendicant missionary. For instance, the many similarities between Margil de Jesus and Fray Junípero Serra, which have been noted by many scholars on the infamous missionary to the Sierra Gorda in California, are not by chance. The exemplified pictorial and hagiographic life of Marfil also gave way to the expeditions of Fray Juan Agustín Morfi and Junípero Serra himself. We must reassess the influence and similarities between all of the aforementioned missionaries, not by repeating their hagiographic parallels, but by way of their slow violence. Ultimately, Franciscan pastoral care and the unreasoning hagiographic uplifting of exemplary Franciscans aided in the conversion and manipulation of native worldviews, spreading Christianity through and at the expense of old age epistemologies. German philosopher Emmanuel Levinas encapsulates this slow violence in totality and infinity. Violence does not consist so much in injuring and annihilating persons as interrupting their continuity, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments, but their own substance, and making them perform actions that destroyed every possibility for further action. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful paper. Emmanuel, it's been so exciting to see this project develop over many years. And dare I say that I see the influence of this year at the Newberry in the real sort of sophistication of the conceptualizations of violence and landscape. Okay, our next speaker is Megan Sullivan, who is an associate professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago, where she specializes in the practices and theories of modernism from Latin America. Her first book is Radical Form, Modernist Abstraction in South America, and she's also a co-editor of a companion to modern and contemporary Latin American and Latino art. Her writing has appeared in Art Margins, Art History, Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture, Non-Site, October, and Oxford Art Journal, and she currently serves as a co-editor of the journal Art Margins. Her talk today is entitled Santa Colonia's Pilgrims and the Possibilities of a Popular Art.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much for being here and for the invitation to speak. I'm coming at these questions, I think, from a little bit of a different point of view than others. I work right now on quite contemporary material, so it's been incredibly useful for me to hear about some of these questions and think more deeply about these questions of sacred space as I'm starting this kind of new project right now. We have to wait a minute for the presentation. Okay, thanks. So on October 26th of 1980, a group of young Lima-based artists who formed the collective EPS Huayco hauled a load of some 12,000 empty milk cans up one of the barren hills that lines the Pan American Highway on the southern outskirts of the Peruvian capital. Each had been painted. You can hopefully see the installation there in the distance. Each of these cans had been painted with enamel paint. Here you can see the cans being brought out. And when assembled on the hillside, produced a massive version and measured roughly 60 square meters of the typical devotional image of Sarita, Colonia. In the decades that followed this installation, the work has accrued a dual significance. First, it has become an active site of pilgrimage for devotees to Sarita, Colonia. And second, it's become a touchstone in the history of contemporary Peruvian art. To understand these two afterlives and their significances, and to analyze the potential relationship between the two, as I hope to do today, requires understanding both the state of popular religion and avant-garde art at the time. So I'm going to begin with the former. So Sarita Colonia was, in 1980, at the zenith of her popularity, drawing devotees from a wide swath of the popular classes in Lima. Born Sarita Colonia Zambrano in the northern Peruvian Andes in 1914, Colonia immigrated with her family to the capital as a child in 1922 in search of economic opportunity. She was sent to a Catholic boarding school where she developed a desire to become a nun, but her family returned to her native Huaraz in 1926, bringing an end to her schooling. Her mother died shortly afterward, and in the early 1930s, she returned to Lima in search of work to support her family. She sold fish in the port of Callao, just north of Lima. She worked in cafes, was a live-in maid, among other jobs. In December 1940, Colonia fell severely ill and died a short time later. The official cause of death was listed as malaria, but her family argues that she died of an overingestion of castor oil, perhaps in an act of self-purification. She was buried in an unmarked common grave in Callao. So the cult of Sarita developed well after her death in the 1960s and 70s, decades after her untimely but otherwise unremarkable death. She was just in her 20s when she died. Scholars attribute the growth of her following to the fact that her father had marked her place in the common grave with a cross, and this lone grave marker became a magnet for offerings brought by visitors to their own loved ones' unmarked resting places. Increasingly, tales of miracles produced after playing at Sarita's grave spread, along with apocryphal stories of her life and death, and her following grew. Sarita's original devotees in the late 60s came from a number of social groups united by their marginal social status. Dock workers from the port of Callao, petty criminals, sex workers, and taxi drivers were prominent among them. As the population of Lima ballooned, thanks to waves of migrants from the Andes, The cult of Sarita grew, especially in the shanty towns that housed these new migrants, and she came to be revered as a patron of the poor. A 1978 newspaper article notes that approximately 2,000 people visited Sarita's grave daily. Her following has waned significantly since the 90s. Colonia, like other folk saints, has not been officially canonized, and the church has largely discouraged devotion to her. In appropriating this image, so kind of shifting back to this avant-garde art group now, in appropriating this image that was found hanging in buses and cabs throughout Lima, the artists of Epes y Huayco were both expanding upon and altering their previous practice. The group had only formed earlier that same year of 1980, so they didn't have a ton of practice behind them. So these cans that had made up Sarita, or at least about 10,000 of them, had been used by the artist some months before. In May of 1980, they had been painted for the first time with an image of salchipapas, a common humble street snack consisting of French fries with cut up hot dogs on top of them, and a number of sauces that were likewise ubiquitous in working class areas of the city. You can see up there their sort of reference image of an order of salchipapas. And then this is an installation of the cans they made outside of the art gallery. And then a second, not great image, but the best we have of the installation of the cans inside a gallery. They displayed this carpet of cans that they had collected on the outskirts of Lima. So they collected the cans themselves in these kind of pueblos jóvenes, these shanty towns. They displayed the carpet of cans at a leading gallery in Lima alongside a set of silkscreen prints that they had produced. And you can see some of those silk screens in the background there. Combined, they marked a notable incursion of popular sensibility into the space of high art that really had never happened in Lima before. The silk-screened images, like the salchipapas, were drawn from the visual ambit of an emerging urban popular culture made by, that was both made by and was remaking migrants that were streaming from the rural Andes into Lima. Take, for example, this one by Mariela Zavallos on your right, which was riffing on a contemporary advertisement for a local radio station. In this cartoonish image, men on a bus leer and whistle at a lone female passenger dressed in a short skirt and knee-high boots, who ignores them, absorbed in her radio program. She calls without lifting her eyes that she'll get off at the Museum of Modern Art, although no such institution existed anywhere in Peru at the time. The following month, in June of 1980, and I just show you one other one that I'll talk about in a minute, these lips that say El arte me llega. The following month, in June 1980, the artist brought the same set of screen prints from their studio in the bohemian neighborhood of Barranco to the historical center of Lima. These are screenshots, so I apologize, from a film, so I apologize for the bad quality. They displayed them in an area that was known as an informal market for posters, where one could find images of the likes of Bruce Lee and Che Guevara. To a large extent, the Huayco artist prints replicated the style of the advertisements and popular images that one would have encountered there. But they do not adhere completely to them. The references to art, its definition, its place, its effect that ran throughout the entire set of prints, here serving as posters on the street, would have been relatively inscrutable or irrelevant for the average passerby in search of a pinup or religious image. In either place, the gallery or the street, Huayco's work fit uncomfortably, and that was arguably the point. In the gallery, the vulgarity of popular culture was off-putting for its well-heeled audience, and that friction between the work and its environment lay at the heart of the exhibition. On the street here, it was met with disinterest or perhaps mild curiosity, or at best, a moment of productive disruption. But the Sarita installation was of a different order, I believe. Before Sarita, the goal of Huayco's engagement with the popular seemed to be primarily one of critiquing and disrupting extant systems and definitions of art by working at the interstices of popular and elite culture in terms of forms of image making. Indeed, we can say that art, its definitions and its limits were at the center of Waiko's work. But the Sarita installation arguably does not work in that space of critique. Rather, its primary goal seems to be one of reaching and being meaningful to a popular audience. The artist, we should note, could not have fully anticipated the work's success, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, but they did evidently work toward that goal. First, they made very few alterations to the standard prayer card image of Sarita Colonia. As Gustavo Bunting's notes, the scholar who's probably worked most on this image, even the pixelated effect of the Salchipapas installation, each can was painted one solid color to give it a kind of bende dot effect, was abandoned for the Sarita, perhaps in an effort to stay as true as possible to the familiar religious icon. So here the image was painted across cans to give a kind of more accurate representation. Second, having been placed on a hillside along the Pan American Highway, it was visible to a large swath of the population, especially people traveling between Lima and the southern Andes, either as migrants or on return visits to their native towns. You can see here a bus that's going to Ayacucho and Cusco, passing by the Sarita installation. This chosen location, far from any gallery or museum space, combined with the unaltered nature of the image from its source, meant that the object's status as a work of art was conditioned on the discursive and interpretive frameworks that would come to surround it. What I mean by this is the work's status as art is signaled to the viewer neither by any intrinsic characteristics, so adherence to a broadly legible genre or medium, like it's not a framed oil painting, nor by any evident institutional framework. It's not in a museum, it's not in a gallery. Only those with knowledge of EPC Waiko and their project would be able to identify this as a work of art. Sarita then not only stays closer to its popular roots in terms of the image itself and its audience, but also largely effaces its status as a work of art to all but a very few who are in the know. Of course, placing their original Salchipapas configuration of the cans onto a hillside might have accompanied at least some of these goals, especially in terms of broad access. But I think Sarita is different from the Salchipapas in several ways. First, I think it's important to note that it was already an image, which means it had already been taken from the flow of everyday life and set aside and made special by the popular classes themselves. While Salchipapas were perhaps just as common as Sarita within the urban environment of Lima, they held no particular meaning. They had not been granted the status of a symbol by that group, even if outsiders like the Waiko artists might have come to see it as such. So for the Waiko artists, I would suggest the two, Sarita and Salchipapas, were interchangeable symbols of the migrants and the popular classes, but of course, they were not equivalent for that popular audience by any means. Sarita was a sacred image with miracle working power and potential. And insofar as she was an image, already embodied on some level the sensibility and taste of those popular classes. We might then mark a divide between the art world insider who knew this to be art, but probably did not believe it to have any sacred meaning or power on a personal level. They were probably not devotees because devotion was so highly classed at this moment. And the popular devotee who believed in the image's power, but did not know it to be art and therefore did not regard it as such. This divide, I would suggest, only grew as the work accrued increasing significance in these separate realms. In ways that the artist could not have fully anticipated, their installation became an active shrine and destination for devotees. Although there's no data as to how many pilgrims visited the site, a video made by the artists, by the Waiko artist, of a visit to their installation in late 1999, so almost 20 years after it was constructed, shows evidence of these forms of devotion. There they found crosses left at the site, as well as garbage left by devotees. The name of Sarita, sorry for the blurry image, but it's been spelled out in succulents above the image. The artist didn't do that. And even repairs were made to the image. You can see painted stones have replaced places where because remember, these cans are 20 years old at this point. They're falling apart, but people have come and made repairs to the image. Although this popular success, was something of a pleasant surprise, I think it's fair to say that the work's retrospective success within the art world relies on its more immediate success as a devotional image. Indeed, I would argue that it was the accumulating evidence of the work's resonance with the popular audience that has fed its status as a landmark work in the history of the Peruvian avant-garde, as well as in the history of popular art. And I want to think now about this latter category a little bit and what this work might be doing within it. So popular art can be understood in at least two ways, and I think Waiko Sarita lies in between them and is sort of an effort to rethink this category. So the term has been used since at least the early 20th century, and here I'm talking about the term, not the practices themselves, to name indigenous and mestizo rural craft practices that were identified and appropriated by sectors of the elite as the artistic heritage of the nation. I'm showing common forms that were kind of grouped into this category in the early 20th century in Peru, mates purilados, toritos de pucará, and retablos. So second, popular art has also been discussed and characterized a set of practices of politically committed high artists directed toward the popular classes. So something like Antonio Berni or David Alfaro Siqueiros' work, or some of the projects under the Allende government in Chile in the early 1970s. So Sarita was evidently a work of erudite artists geared toward a popular audience, so seems to come closer to being, something like this. Nonetheless, what it offers that audience was not an ideologically charged message or a vision of a radically different future. Waiko Sarita, in effect, gave back to the people an image that they had themselves originally produced and did it without altering it. This might seem to align it, in fact, more closely with that first definition, the craft practices, kind of a long continuity of craft practices. But of course, it's not quite that either. The work did not celebrate the sort of reserve of technical skill harbored by the nation that was so important to most traditional definitions of popular art. And what was being appropriated was not really style or even some understanding of the authenticity of the maker, but rather the power of the popular image and the power of the belief that surrounded it. It was an image that could, in the mind of its devotees, do things. So for an art world audience, this work is an evocative and even powerful image of devotion brought close to, but not wholly collapsed with, the category of art. What we have then is not so much a convergence of popular fervor and contemporary art, but kind of a strange layering of the two on top of one another. They exist in a single object, but the very meaning and status of that object varies wildly depending on who the viewer is, the believer in Sarita versus the believer in art. But what did the artist see in this conjunction, not to say merging of the two? I think one answer was that the artist sought to reinforce high art, which found itself at a major moment of crisis in Peru and elsewhere, by kind of drawing on a wellspring of belief from elsewhere. Gustavo Buntings has discussed this question in terms of its aura. If Waiko's interest in the banal objects of everyday life and in multiples, such as printmaking, suggests a break with the traditional auratic work of high art, religious devotion would somehow restore that aura, if only obliquely. Put differently, in a moment in which the typical means by which art was set apart from the world was collapsing, tapping into popular religious devotion offered another way of imagining art's distinction from the everyday. But reviving art was not their only concern, and indeed, it'd be fair to say that they were equally interested in destroying it, at least as it was presently understood. In a moment when art was being radically rethought in terms of dematerialization, the introduction of the ready-made, amongst other changes, the rise of performance, the artists of EPS y Waiko also wanted to radically rethink what popular art might be and how it would relate to high art. If the latter, if high art were no longer a skillfully crafted object, or even an object at all, maybe popular art would could no longer be understood as a wellspring of manual skill or historically continuous tradition. What Waiko is perhaps proposing then is that these religious practices and the social worlds they helped configure, rather than any given object or style or craft practice, might be a way of thinking of this equivalent. It is not then even the image of Sarita, but the systems and practices and rituals and forms of collectivity that the image around that image that could be understood as the popular equivalent to art as it was being reconceived at the moment. What we are left with then, to my mind, is a work of popular art as a sort of palimpsest, in which wildly different sets of goals and beliefs are layered onto this single object, proximate but never intersecting. Put differently, there's a total collapse in terms of style and taste that is nevertheless demarcated by systems of belief and understanding. Although it likely never happened, I find it interesting to think of the religious pilgrim and the art pilgrim standing side by side in front of this object, seeing the same thing, yet radically different things at the same time. Nevertheless, they were both in a moment of imagining otherwise, and I think therein might lie their connection. Thank you. Sit up here. Yes. Gracias.
So thank you so much, Emmanuel and Megan, for two very different ways of conceptualizing pilgrimage. And we are now open for questions. Does anyone have one?
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoy it. And I was wondering if have you found a relationship between Sarita devotion and Saint Rose of Lima, because it is very suggestive, this rose motif, so big, so giant. So I think it's like a revival or something like that. And the face is very similar to Saint Rose. So perhaps there is a relationship between both devotions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. Is this on? No. It is? Okay.
It's my patron saint.
Is it? So yeah, I think the connection to Santa Rosa is absolutely there. I think something that I, as I develop this project, I need to delve into is to kind of better understand, especially at this juncture, who, was there a sense that devotion to Santa Rosa was restricted or dominated by certain class elements? I think she was largely the
maybe the upper
reals.
classes
Exactly.
were more direct to
this is
her.
my guess, but I definitely have to find out more. And so I see these similarities, especially the rose motif, as being a way to find this unofficial, and I didn't have time to develop this, but I think a lot of this is about developing a kind of, deeply held religious practice, but outside of the confines of the church. And I think that the parallels are absolutely there, and it's about kind of finding our own.
Yes,
Santa
a
Rosa.
popular Santa Rosa for low classes or something like that.
So yeah, I
Okay.
think that it's absolutely there.
Okay,
And something
thank you
I
very
really
much.
Thank you for that. It's something I'm going to think more about.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Both very interesting papers. I have a question for both. For Megan, what about the perenniality of that art performance? It means about the materials they used and whether they really wanted it to last a long time. That's the first question. And for Emmanuel, maybe you told it, but I didn't catch it. The relationship with the images you showed and the question of the Black legend of well, raised by how the Dominicans and Bartolomé de las Casas dealt with the treatments, no, that were given to the indigenous people.
Yeah, so in terms of the durability, I don't think they were thinking about that. I think, again, something I didn't also get into there, these are largely Marxist artists who were very interested in the beginning, which is also why I find Sarita so interesting as a turn in questions of the role of multinational corporations in poverty and underdevelopment in Lima. So they were really interested in the fact that all of this canned milk was being imported by these major multinationals. So I think that there's a real symbolic resonance. And when they first layered that with this image of another kind of food and form of consumption, they were really thinking about these circuits, these kind of economic circuits. So something else happens, but I think that the cans were largely symbolic rather than about duration. And I think that this kind of took a life of its own in a way that's really interesting. In terms of the second question, I haven't thought about this, and that's why giving this paper at this conference has been so useful, because it's making me think about these longer kind of religious histories that don't always come into my work as a modernist. And so I'm really appreciating new ways to push this research and think more about kind of longer histories of religious devotion in Peru. And I have lots of ideas coming out of this. So I don't have an answer, but I appreciate the suggestion.
The connection between the situation in the Chichimeca and Bartolomé de las Casas Black legend was done by Stafford Paul when he mentions that the solution by the Dominicans, he calls it soft intervention. So it's yet still another form of intervention, which is precisely what I'm trying to show with the Franciscans, that we always give them the benefit of the doubt precisely for that reason, because they learn the language of the native peoples, because they have this pastoral approach of one-on-one, understanding sometimes even people's private lives. And one of the reasons why I turn to domesticity is precisely because of that. The ways, for example, that in the early waves of colonization, they go directly to children, because children are the ones that go into the parents' homes. That's why we have the history of the Los Niños Mártires de Tlaxcala. So you have all of these soft, quote unquote, interventions or soft colonizations, which at the end of the day is still a form of colonization.
Any other questions?
Thank you both. Excuse me. Thank you both for those excellent papers. I was struck by the fact that both of you are discussing landscapes that have deep histories of ritual action, movement in time, and migration histories as well. And I wonder how those factor in your respective studies. Obviously, I can't stop thinking about the Nazca lines and Paracas and sort of the way that your artwork sort of activates the space that has this layered history, right? And by the way, it does seem like they manipulated the image enormously in terms of scale, obviously, and that is sort of inextricable from her reception. And Emmanuel, in your case, obviously, we're talking about a deep history of a landscape that has already seen multiple migrations and representations of those migrations. And I wonder how those histories play into those historical movements over that landscape play into each of your respective studies, and if in fact they do.
In terms, I was just reading an essay about the articulation of wilderness from classical period to today. The author, I forgot the name of the author, but the author mentions how the wilderness was outside of the city in the classical period. With Christianity, it's reversed. The dangers that the classical period saw in the wilderness, the Christianity is migrated to the city. The city becomes the center of sin. What's interesting about the Americas is a combination of both, because as Kirsten Pye Buick says, the wilderness was the site of witches and savages, but at the same time, it's a necessary space for introspect, for spirituality. So one of the things about these Mendicant orders, and I study the Franciscans, is the ways in which the landscape is going to transform both, like that duality that is coming together in unfathomable ways in the Americas. And I always think about landscape in terms of process. And so it's the idea of how landscape is always changing. So for that, and then this is research that for the third chapter that I just started, but I want to pair these images to maps, because maps always show a middle of nowhere, but then some European finds gold and all of a sudden became somewhere. So we have to think about the desert as a process in relation to movements of colonization and domestication patterns.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think this is something that Gustavo Buntings has written about a little bit, and it's something I'm trying to find out more about, that inciting Sarita. And although there was her grave in Callao as a sort of site of pilgrimage, actually Sarita is primarily a very mobile image. It actually primarily you encounter it in taxis and buses in Lima at this time. But so giving it this sighting, Buntings has talked about it a lot as a kind of return to an idea of like the Waka as this, as a, landscape and the sacred being inseparable. And so this is something I'm thinking about. I don't know if this is his kind of, and he was very close to these artists. So I'm not sure if this is like whether this is something the devotees themselves felt or saw, or something that the artists wanted. And that's always the tension, I think, with working with this project, is you have these things the artists, who are largely coming from the upper classes, are wanting this to be, and then what it actually is. And, obviously we have a lot more archival records of what the artist wanted this to be, and not so many records of, how it was understood and practiced. And so this is something I'm kind of wrestling with as I try to think about this work.
Yeah, I have a question for Emmanuel. Thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious about the difference between the Spanish expansionism or imperialism with indigenous also expansionism. So can we apply also this concept of soft violence when, for example, the Mexica or the Inca or the Quiche expanded to other regions? I don't know, what the difference or the similarities between like them and the Spanish?
It's case by case. I'm looking right now at the role of the Apaches and Comanches in relationship to this idea of expansion, because first the threat in New Mexico, for instance, were the Pueblo peoples, even though they were named pueblos because they actually have fixed dwellings. Tenían sus propios pueblos, no eran nómadas. But the Comanche Empire, which is also not a fixed dwelling, it's a mobile empire. It's something that was a huge threat. And in some of these maps that I want to see, that I'm looking at by Miri Pacheca, which is one of the cartographers that I'm thinking about, the Comanche have guns, because the French are trading guns with the Comanche. So they become a huge threat to the Spanish. So we have to think about in relation to historical context, because all of those things completely change. Something happens in Texas that is very different than what's happening in New Mexico, that is very different than what happens to the Chichimeca. But the nuances of that context, it's always very complicated. We tend to look at history as black and white, good versus evil, but it's always so much more nuanced than that. So I'm glad you raised that concern, because it's something that I'm really aware about. Yeah.
And we have a coffee break of 30 minutes. But during that coffee break, I believe that we may have the opportunity to look at some treasures of the Newbery collection. Now, in order to go upstairs into the reading room, you need a Newbery reader card. So if you don't have one of those, please go to the welcome desk and start signing up for one. We can have maybe 3 or 4 people come upstairs at once. So also, pace yourselves a little bit.